But I don't know, people might have seen Virginia Trioli having a discussion with Dame Elizabeth Murdoch during the week, who seems to have become the mother of the nation at her 100th year. You know, I'm in the arts sector, so I'm very grateful that she's very generous with her benefaction to culture, and we're going to talk about your provocation at the end of the book where we might as well go there right now. He says that shame on the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He's slightly less hysterical about it, but basically his line is that the Metropolitan Museum of Art should not have spent $45 million or fundraised $45 million to buy the work of a great Italian master, and that money should have been given to, those in need, those who are, enduring poverty. Maybe you should...
Yeah, of course, I mean, the Metropolitan Museum of Art has a mission, and I suppose you could say that's what that institution should do. That's its role, is to build up the best possible collection of art. So in a way, I would say the people who had approached for fundraising were the ones who should have said, no, I'm not going to help you buy this. It was a Duccio. Because in the world in which we're living, there are 10 million children dying every year, and I want to help them. The $45 million could help thousands and thousands of people, or not just save life, but there's a lot of very specific things that you could do with it. I talk about other things that you can get. The Fred Hollows Foundation, for example, can restore someone's sight for about $50. Someone who can't afford a cataract operation, which of course all of us in Australia, if we develop cataracts, will be able to have for free. If you live in Ethiopia or Eritrea or wherever, you're not going to be able to get that. But you can help people to get it. I talk about obstetric fistula, which is a condition that doesn't kill people but absolutely ruins the lives of young women who have difficult labours, perhaps because they're too small, too young, too undernourished to have children, and their entire life can be ruined by this condition, which again can be surgically repaired for about $450. So you think about $45 million and how many fistulas, how many people can that restore sight to. I just don't think it's a good sense of priorities to spend money on art at this level when we're in that situation. Now, I'm not against spending money on art. I'm not against having great art collections, but I think we should regard the world we're in as being in an emergency situation. And until we have done everything we can to either overcome that emergency and reduce that large-scale mass poverty, or else we've shown that we just can't do it for some reason, that I'm wrong, and despite putting our resources into it, we can't do it. Until we get to that point, I don't think we're justified in that kind of expenditure on the arts.
Okay, we won't get into a brawl, and we'll keep going. You canvass a number of propositions. No, I think it is a complicated argument, and I think all of us would say, those of us who like to go to gallery sites, and for the people to have access and the kind of pleasure to look at a great work of art is enormously nourishing. Very hard to make that argument when we're talking about people who have no nourishment. So anyway, it's a complicated argument, as you know better than I do. And you test out a whole lot of propositions in the book about that are kind of the conventions, the truisms that are set up against personal giving, that we're innately selfish, that international aid ends up in the wrong hands, that aid creates dependency, that population explosion is the cause of poverty, that we have compassion fatigue. And we've got about 5 minutes left. Maybe you'd like to talk to those issues very quickly. You do them very effectively in the book, and of course everybody's going to buy the book, but
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of myths about aid, which I think I needed to address in the book. And one of them, of course, is that, in fact, I've been doing some radio and publicity about the book, and I had it in a talkback caller just last week. Somebody said, if you give to these organisations, they take about 60 cents in every dollar you give, so most of it doesn't reach the people that you want it to. I have no idea where he got that figure from. I have no idea what organisation he was talking about. Certainly if you're talking about the major Australian organisations that you would think of giving to, whether it's Oxfam or World Vision or whoever it is, and none of them have expenses anything like that. They might have expenses in the range of 20, 25 cents. But, it takes an organisation. You can't run an organisation without some administrative people, and you have to pay them something. If you cut the administrative expenses to almost nothing, you'll end up just handing money over to people in the developing countries and you won't know what's happening to it. So if you want to have effective aid, you've got to accept a certain amount of it to go for administration and oversight. But we should be prepared to do that because, after all, the money that we have is really doing much less for us than it can do for them. So the value of the 75 cents when it gets to the developing world is much greater than the value of the dollar that we're giving up. So, then people say, well, how do we know that it's working? We've put so much money into the developing countries. And it's true that we have to check that what we're doing is effective, and I talk about some organisations that are doing that are evaluating aid in quite rigorous ways to see what really works. It's true that in the past, particularly official aid, government aid, has been used for political purposes. Even Australia's aid, I would say, still has a political tinge to it. The country that we give most aid to is Indonesia, which I think has some political motivation. And Iraq is currently our second largest, or second or third largest aid recipient, and that clearly has a political motivation. So, yes, there are things that go wrong with aid, but the NGOs generally have a better record than government aid. So, I think you need to look at that. I think you need to not use this as an excuse for saying there's nothing I can do, I'm powerless, and therefore I can just go on and enjoying my comfortable life. I think when you do look at it honestly, you'll see that aid can be effective and often is. Now, I think I focused on that issue, and I know there was a whole string of other ones you brought up. The population issue, right? Yes. So I'm sympathetic to those who say, look, isn't population the root of the problem? And don't we have to do something to make sure the population doesn't just keep growing, that if we just give aid, population will grow and we'll have to give more aid in a few years. But the question is, how can we effectively do something about this? And trying to educate people in developing countries, particularly trying to educate girls, has been shown to be highly effective in reducing fertility. So we have to get people assistance to do that. At the last talk I gave in Melbourne on this topic, which was at Melbourne University last week, run by Readings Bookshop, they actually asked for money from the audience, and they raised $3,500, which is enough to build a school in Vietnam. And I thought that, firstly, that shows how cheaply you can do things like build a school in the developing world. Secondly, that is the kind of thing that you can do that will help to educate girls and reduce population in that country, or reduce future population. So there are lots of things we can do about this. If you want to donate directly to organisations that are working for fertility, reducing fertility, International Planned Parenthood Federation and so on, you can do that too. I think that's perfectly acceptable choice. So, but again, it's not an excuse for saying there's nothing we can do, so we should just sit on our hands.
And we will take questions in just a moment, but I thought I might make you read it because, well, it's the Sabbath, but anyway, it's from Aquinas. And you quote, he cites 12th century canon law, and that has this extraordinarily powerful statement just by way of...
Right, yeah. I cited this because some people say that, well, what I'm saying is a kind of a radical view or a socialist view, or, people in America particularly say that. And of course, if you can say truly it's a socialist view, then it's obviously, there's no point in discussing it anymore. And I really wanted to show that there are a lot of people who are in some ways are quite conservative thinkers who actually take this view, and one of them is Thomas Aquinas, who I don't always agree with. But Thomas Aquinas actually says that whatever we have in what he calls superabundance, which is over and above what we need to satisfy our reasonable needs, we owe of natural right to the poor for their subsistence. And he cites this 12th century work, the Decretum Gratiani, which says, the bread which you withhold belongs to the hungry, the clothing you shut away to the naked, and the money you bury in the earth is the redemption and freedom of the penniless. And I often wish that those who are influenced by Aquinas and by other Christian thinkers who've said similar things would actually read that and take it seriously and live up to it.
So then just prompts me to ask one last question, which is, when you hear Barack Obama railing against junkets, executives and their junkets. Do you feel that maybe socialism has come to the US?
Well, actually, I mean, the funny thing is that socialism came with the bailout, right?
Yes,
Which
exactly.
even a significant number of Republicans supported. Right. And this was really the state taking a significant interest in banks and private enterprise institutions. And, you know, when it came down to the crunch, there were a couple of hardline ideologues, I have to say, who voted against it. But most of the Republicans, when it came to the crunch, sacrificed the principles they've been talking about for years rather than risk letting the US financial system collapse. As for Obama, yeah, I think I do feel tremendously encouraged. Of course, you know, I'm aware that sometimes you get these great feelings about politicians and they don't always live up to it. But there was one particular moment, actually, which was the day before Obama was inaugurated as president, that I thought really was a sign of something. I don't know if any of you have watched video of the pre-inauguration concert that was given on the Washington Mall on January the 19th. And the moment I'm thinking about, you can find it on YouTube. Google Pete Seeger and Bruce Springsteen,
Absolutely.
Right? And they actually sang before this crowd of millions with the president-elect sitting in the front row and kind of nodding along, more or less singing along. They sang "This Land Is Your Land," song some of you might know, written by Woody Guthrie, which has often been recorded. I actually was on Margaret Throsby's program where you get to play bits of music, and I wanted them to play this particular version of it that was sung. Well, they couldn't play off YouTube. They said there might be copyright issues or something. Auntie is a little conservative about that. And then they looked for a recording, you know, just Pete Seeger, because he's recorded "This Land Is Your Land" many times. But they could not find one which included all the verses, including the verses he sang that night, which include really verses about that the land also belongs to the people who are standing in queues to line up for relief, you know, the poor, and it talks about signs that say no trespassing, but there was nothing on the other side, so we crossed over. It's really quite radical, and of course Pete Seeger was black-banned for decades after the McCarthy years because of his left-wing views, could not appear on radio or television. And to see him in his 80s standing up singing this in front of the president-elect, in front of millions of people, I thought, well, you know, it really was a great sign of hope.
I thought I was the only other one that was sort of weeping, you know, in a maudlin fashion at it. And I thought no one else cares about Pete Seeger. Nobody remembers who Pete Seeger is or that song. But so it's great that there's two of us there. But it was actually very interesting. Well, there were millions there, but I had a sense that this was a moment of, you know, and maybe it's illusory, and that's what's so interesting about it. Of empowerment, of a kind of idea, this land is your land. And you watch, you know, us sitting in Australia watching millions of Americans take back the idea that they might, you know, full of black Americans who never believed that a black person would ever become president. It was a kind of...
look, after enduring 8 years of George W., it was just fantastic.
That's right. Yeah. OK, we need to take questions from the floor. Yes, we've got one there. So I think the question is whether in this current climate where there's extreme, you know, poverty, human beings are suffering enormously, whether we are, I hope I'm getting this right, whether it's fair to say that the interests of animals are of equal significance. Is that a proper way to characterise your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Ralph refers to the principle of equal consideration of interest, which is the sort of philosophical principle that I talk about in my more philosophical books, and I do think it applies to animals as well as to humans. And I do contribute to some of the organisations fighting animal cruelty as well. And it's very hard to say, you know, how much should you give to each of them. I think perhaps we just make personal choices here where we don't really have a measure for deciding which one we should be giving more to. It depends a little bit on how effective you think they're going to be, the particular organisations, in fighting these things. So there can be moments when something can be particularly effective. For example, one animal cause that I gave to, a lot of people don't know that on the day that that Obama was elected president, California had a referendum to ban the battery cage and a couple of other methods of factory farming. which I donated to support that campaign because I thought that was a pivotal moment when the United States, which has been very conservative on this issue, I mean, Australia has too, we haven't done this, but Europe has been more progressive. So when the United States could actually take a different direction. So that seemed to me something that was definitely worth putting some money into, even though you could argue, well, that same money could have gone to the people, the children I'm talking about, or helping people to see, whatever. So I think that we just have to try and look at our opportunities and say, where can we reduce suffering the most? Where can we do the most good? I would say this, though, that I think if we have a world in which there is so much poverty, it's really hard to get people in those developing countries to give any consideration to animals at all. They're always going to put their own interests ahead, and that will include things like cutting down forests, which are the last refuge of wildlife. So I think we have to try and get the world somewhere to a point where at least everybody can meet their basic needs before we can get global progress on the issue of animals, which is not to say that we can't get local progress in other countries.
Other questions? So the question is regarding the effects, the long-term effects of global warming and climate change, and the individual response we can have to such a kind of enormous environmental shift, and the question of collective action. So it's where do we sit in relation to an event, it's kind of the grandeur, if you like, if that's not the right word, but what, the immensity of global change and how we respond to it.
Right. So I think you're absolutely right. Climate change is happening. I think the level that you mentioned, 2 degrees Celsius rise by 2050, looks like it's almost inevitable now. Even if we start making drastic cuts pretty soon, we're already at close to that level, and the CO2 is up there, and it doesn't look like we're going to get rid of it. And the battle is whether we can hold it at only 2 degrees Celsius, which is actually pretty serious. And also it's true that the bulk of that burden, certainly the human costs of it, are going to fall on developing countries, because even though we've had, I think, terrible evidence of the damage that climate change is doing just in the last week, I think we're going to get more days like we've had in the last week. That's the forecast over the coming years. So we have very dramatic evidence that even an affluent country like this cannot be immune from it, and of course there's the drought and the water shortages. But when you think of what that is going to do to much poorer countries that cannot mobilise the resources we have, and what sea level rise is going to do to countries where there's millions of people farming rich, low-lying delta land like in Bangladesh, we are going to cause more poverty because of what we're doing. So we do have a responsibility to do something about that. I think the balance of individual and collective action is slightly different here, although I do think we should all take individual action. I think we should be minimising our own carbon emissions, we should be installing solar, we should be driving less or driving more fuel-efficient cars if we have to drive. But I also think this is an area where really we need the governments to work something out and to make it a legally required system, or to put the right set of incentives in place, whether it's a carbon tax or a carbon trading scheme. So we do have to put as much pressure as we can on our government and say, we want you to act here. In Australia, the government sort of campaigned on making climate change a big issue in contrast to the previous government. Now it looks like they're sliding away from that, at least sliding away from doing something really significant and serious and taking a global leadership position on that. And I think we need to get back to our representatives and say, this is not good enough. This carbon trading scheme you're talking about is not what we voted for. We need to take a lead. We are one of the highest per capita emitters, and it's just wrong for us to impose this burden on others, as well as the damage we're doing to ourselves.
So the question is whether why the focus on children in poverty? Is there an ethical kind of burden placed on that, or if you pose the question in that way, or is it a kind of political judgment made by Peter?
Yeah, I don't think there's an ethical argument. I mean, I don't think I placed the whole focus on children in the book. I do quote that figure, as I did here, of 10 million children. It's a UNICEF figure. The figures for the number of people in total, including adults who die annually of poverty-related causes, are not quite so clear. At one point I quote a total figure of 18 million, but it's a little more difficult to defend the accuracy of that figure. Also, I do think, as you suggested, that there is something about children that appeals to us emotionally more, and I'm trying to use that. A lot of people would think about adults, well, you know, if they'd worked harder or made smarter choices or whatever, then they wouldn't be in poverty. That's not true for most of these people, but nevertheless, you can avoid even getting into that discussion by focusing on children who obviously have no responsibility for the situation that they're in. So it just undercuts that objection.
There was another question over here, yes. So the question is, what's Peter's view of governments who put conditions around their aid, for example, clinics that provide abortions in third world countries? What's Peter's view?
My view is that it depends on the conditions. That example you gave, I don't think abortion is morally wrong. I think women should have the option of deciding whether they're pregnant or not, even if they have got pregnant unwillingly. So that seems to me quite wrong, and I'm glad that one of the things that President Obama did immediately after coming to office was to rescind that ban which Bush had put on. But there may be other conditions that you want to put on aid, such as ensuring that women have equal access to aid and control over the situation, where I would like to see conditions put on aid. So it really depends on the individual case. I think the donors do have a right to say, look, if we think that the aid is being given in circumstances where it's not going to be effective, it's not going to reach everyone that we want it to reach, or it's going to be discriminatory against one group of people, I think it's okay for the donors to say, unless you can assure us that that's going to change, we'll go elsewhere. There are other poor countries where we do think we can reach everyone, and we'll make that choice.
And we'll take one more question and then we'll have to bring it to a close. The question is, what's Peter Singer's view of microcredit, and can it be useful in very poor communities?
Yes, I do talk a little bit about microcredit in the book. It's one of those examples where, in fact, women do feature strongly, because women seem to have a better record of repaying these very small loans than men do. So I think microcredit has been helpful in many areas. The kind of case, the classical case where Mohammed Yunus actually began the whole thing, is a good illustration. He knew about a group of women who were weavers in a village, but because they had always been poor, they had never been able to own the looms on which they weaved. So they had to rent those looms from people who charged them quite exorbitant rents, and although they worked hard and sold their products for a reasonable price, by the time they'd paid the rent, they were never going to get out of poverty. So he took the equivalent of $27 from his own pocket and gave it to a group of 40 women. So you can see how little money we're talking about, $27 among 40 women. And they used that as a revolving loan so that someone could buy the loom, not rent it, make money, pay the loan back, pass it on to the next woman, and so on. And in those circumstances, it can work brilliantly. But it's not a panacea. It doesn't work absolutely everywhere. It doesn't work in quite the same way. It may not, as some suggestions, it doesn't really always reach the poorest of the poor. Some of them are not enterprising enough to be able to use the loan in a way that produces sustainable income for them. They have to use it rather to combat emergencies and so on. And that can still be a good thing. But I think it's a valuable way of helping people. And incidentally, for those who want to have a direct face-to-face relationship, there is even a website called Kiva, Kiva.org, where you can make your own loan to a particular individual, and Kiva will take just 10% of what you are loaning in order to set up the system and to audit that the loans are properly used. So I think it's useful, but I don't think it's the be-all and end-all of the situation. And since I've just mentioned websites, can I? I would also encourage you to look at a website that I've set up relating to the book, which has the same title as the book, so it's www.thelifeyoucansave.com, which has more information. It has information about organisations you can give to, and it also has a place where you can pledge to give the percentage of your income that accords to what your income level is, as Louise mentioned. And although it's actually only been operating for 2 weeks, came out when the book was published in Australia, and Australia is so far the only country where the book's been published. It will appear next month in the United States. We've already got more than 400 people who've pledged to meet that standard, which I find very encouraging. So I hope some of you will have a look at it and add to that number.
And just before we close, I should say that all the authors' royalties from the sale of this book will be donated to Oxfam, and Text Publishing is a portion of their revenue from the book will also be going to another project regarding fistula surgery and relief in Africa. Peter Singer, thank you very much for giving us your time. A wonderful book, very important subject, and thank you very much for today.
Thanks, Louise. Thank you for all your questions.